Hi there. Welcome to this webinar on your lawyer brain in relationships. I'm Cara Lowenthal. I'm your host, and I'll tell you a bit more about me in a moment. But first, I'm going to go over the order of events, because we all know lawyers like to know what's coming. All right, so first, some housekeeping. I'm going to talk about audio, video, recording, and the chat box for those of you who are attending live. I'm also going to do some introductions. I'm going to talk about thought work, which is the primary model around all of which my coaching is based. And this is not lawyer specific. This applies to everyone, but my lawyer coaching really builds on this premise. So it's important to have a basic understanding of it in order to really get the most out of this webinar. Then I'm going to talk about our topic du jour, lawyer brain. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by lawyer brain in general, and then also the kind of subtypes of lawyer brain that cause the most problems in relationships. In this webinar, I'm going to mostly be using examples from romantic relationships, although I'll also be occasionally using examples from professional relationships as well. It applies to family, friends, your relationship with a mailman, really anything. Then finally, I'm going to talk about what you can do. So it's not just a bleak picture. I'm going to talk about awareness, acceptance, and actions. And I know that sounds a little woo-woo, the awareness and acceptance part, but I'm going to explain to you quite logically how they're really necessary in order for the action part to work. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping. All of y'all who are on live, your video and audio are automatically off for privacy concerns. You can turn them on if you want. If you have a question, there's a little function that you can click, you see in the bottom, to raise your hand. And if you want to send me a chat or a message, there's a chat function also along the bottom of the screen. And just be aware, the default is to everyone on the webinar. So if you want to chat just me, like you have a question you want to be coached on that you don't want to be identified for, you have to select to chat to me. And then obviously this is being recorded. Okay, so who am I? My name is Cara Lowenthal, JD, as you can see. I'm a certified cognitive life coach, and Redesign Your Mind is my website. It's www.redesignyourmind.com. And if you registered for this webinar, then you are registered on my site, and you will be getting more information from me about that. Just a little bit about my background. I have a BA from Yale University and a JD from Harvard Law School. I was a clerk on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals down in New Orleans. Then I litigated for a couple of years. I did impact litigation. And then I tried academia. I held an academic fellowship at Yale, the law school. And then I did some policy work. I held a joint policy and academic fellowship at Columbia Law School, where I ran a small think tank. So I tell you this to say I tried basically all the lawyer jobs, and I was pretty stressed out during all of them because I didn't know all of the tools and ways of thinking about my brain that I'm going to share with you today. I'm currently a certified cognitive life coach through the Life Coach School, and I'm working on my Master Coach certification, which I will have in about 6 months. All right. So the basic thought work model, those of you who have worked with me one-on-one already or have read some of my work, some of my blogs or my opt-ins, my free guides, you may be a little bit familiar with this already. It's always good to review. And this thought work model really is the core of the coaching I do and is the reason that I can coach anyone on anything, and I mean that literally. But it also helped me refine the lawyer version that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it's good to have this kind of primary foundation. So, generally, our default understanding of the world is that external things and other people cause our feelings, right? So we're taught that from an early age. You hurt your sister's feelings, you should apologize. It's natural to feel sad when X thing happens, when your pet dies. Right? It's so common sense that it's almost hard to explain it. We all just assume that our feelings are a reaction to things outside of us, how other people act or external circumstances that just happen through fate or nature or whatever. The entire premise of the thought work that I teach is that that's incorrect, or rather it elides an important intervening cause. right? So you're lawyers, you're familiar with the idea of intervening causation. The intervening cause is your thought. So really what happens is an external thing happens, you have a thought about it, and the thought is what causes your feeling, right? So what you experience before you know how to dissect these is your partner may say, why did you talk to our child that way? That was a bad way to do it. You immediately feel angry. You think, I'm angry because my partner said this thing about my parenting and my partner shouldn't do that. That's not why you're angry, that your partner said the thing. You are angry because you have a thought, my partner should not do that. That thought is what makes you angry, right? Another way to think about this is you can see in your own life, of course, that circumstances happen and different people have different reactions to them, right? Anything from a small conversation in the office to a global tragedy. Different people have different feelings about the same external circumstance. And that's because those different people's feelings are produced by filtering the circumstance through their individual thoughts, right? They have different thoughts in reaction to the circumstance, and that produces different feelings for them. So I often like to say when you don't know about how this works, what you experience with a feeling is kind of like somebody rushed past your room and threw in like a mustard gas bomb, right? Or a smoke bomb. All of a sudden you're just choking, you feel the smoke, you can't see, but you don't know where it came from and you think it was caused by something external. The thought is the thing that threw the smoke bomb in there and ran off, right? But as you learn about this, you start to be able to reverse engineer it, and when you have a feeling, you start to be able to figure out, oh, what was I thinking, right? So circumstance causes you to have a thought, and that thought is what causes your feeling, right? Your feeling is not caused by external circumstances. So that is the first half of the thought work model. The second half has to do with how our feelings drive our actions, and our actions produce results in our lives and also have effects on the outside world. That's kind of the next level of this work, and it's not really important to understand for the purpose of this webinar. But if there's something that interests you, you can always drop me a line. I'm happy to explain it to you further. So, circumstance causes thought, thought causes feeling. That's the thing to remember. The good news about this is that if your thoughts are what are causing your feelings, you can learn to change your thoughts, right? You can learn new ways of thinking. You learn to think like a lawyer. That was quite a grueling process, right? You can learn how to think in a different way. The reason that's great news is you can't control external circumstances, right? You can't control how other people act. You can't control natural disasters. You can't control fate. Or, you don't have to believe in fate, but just things that are beyond your control. There's a million things beyond your control that you can't control. You can control your thoughts in reaction and about them, and thus you can create the feelings you want to have. Okay, so that's true for everybody, but lawyer brain is a sort of very specialized version of this. So when I say lawyer brain, what I mean is the cumulative effect of thought patterns that are taught in law school and then practiced as a lawyer. There are many forms, and you can learn more about them on my website. The subtypes that interfere most in personal relationships, especially with a romantic partner, are the following, and I'm going to talk about each one in depth, so it's okay that you don't know what these mean. Catastrophizing, adversarial orientation, fear of being wrong or defensiveness, and trouble spotting. And you can see I have a Trojan horse cartoon here. So that's because lawyer brain is absolutely useful in some circumstances, right? I am not saying that it is not useful to think like a lawyer. When you are a lawyer, it is useful to think like a lawyer, especially at work. Now, that can still get out of hand, right? As you'll see when I start talking about the subtypes, these subtypes are also things that people bring to their professional relationships and to their thinking about their work and their careers in ways that can also be problematic. So it can still get out of hand even in the office. But in the office, at least it's useful, right? At home, it's often really pretty counterproductive. So it took you a long time and a lot of money and effort to learn to think like a lawyer. And we're not trying to wipe the slate clean, right? We're not trying to wipe that out of your brain. But what we want to do is teach you how to think not like a lawyer as well, so that you can turn your lawyer brain on and off when you need it and when you don't, right? That's the goal. Turn lawyer brain on when reviewing a contract, but turn it off when it comes to reacting to the email a partner sends you at 2 a.m., and definitely turn it off when it comes to resolving conflicts with a spouse. Okay, so let's talk about each of these subtypes. The first subtype is catastrophizing. So catastrophizing means looking for the worst possible outcome. What I see a lot is that my clients take a small disagreement and they make it mean something huge about the relationship, right? So their partner will say something like, why didn't you clean up the kitchen after dinner? And instead of just engaging with that, right, either, giving a reason or saying, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to, or I should have, and doing it. Instead, in their heads, they take this to the ultimate extreme. He's always upset that I don't clean up the kitchen after dinner. We have such different levels of how clean we want things to be. We've been fighting about this our whole relationship for 10 years. I don't see how we're ever going to resolve it. How is this relationship ever going to work if he's always going to be upset about the kitchen, right? In 2 seconds, we're at divorce court over whether or not somebody cleaned up the kitchen in your head, right? The reason I have this this picture here is because, as I always say to my clients, it's like any interaction that you have ends in the destruction of the earth, right? Now, your brain is doing this for a reason. It's always trying to ward off disaster, and you learn to do this in law school, right? When you are drafting a contract, you do want to think about the possible, every absolute worst case scenario that could happen because you're trying to protect your client, right? If you're coming up with your trial strategy, you definitely want to think about what are all the things that could go wrong so you can try to prepare for them. It is useful in those contexts, right? It is not useful in your interpersonal interactions. And here's why. Not only is it's just anxiety producing for you, so it doesn't feel great, but it also makes every interaction too heavy with meaning and imagined impact, right? So it really clouds your ability to see clearly and or to be strategic because you've put so much weight on this tiny interaction, right? You've made the interaction over why you didn't clean the kitchen stand in for every problem you've had with your spouse and your disparate levels of cleanliness and the tension in your marriage over chores, right? You've now piled all of that on this one interaction about the dishes, and you've told yourself that all of this is probably a reason it'll never work out and you'll have to get divorced. Right? This is all happening subconsciously, but it's why you may experience disproportionate levels of anxiety when you have interpersonal conflict. I mean, that's really a fascinating thing about my lawyer clients often is that they have a lot of these lawyer brain patterns that make it difficult for other people to interact with them sometimes, or for them to interact with other people. But they're also disproportionately anxious about the discord in their personal lives because of the catastrophizing, right? Because they have a hard time just seeing conflict for kind of the size and level that it is, and it always turns into the worst possible outcome or scenario. So that's catastrophizing. And catastrophizing, I kind of think of it as like the primary problem with lawyer brain because it actually really leads into some of the other behaviors too. So adversarial orientation. We all learn the adversarial method in law school, right? This becomes your default lawyer brain position. And that means your brain is always set up to evaluate any assertion you hear, to pass judgment, to agree or disagree, to have an opinion about it, right? And that means that your lawyer brain is always looking for what's wrong with what's been said and for places to disagree. Like sometimes when I give a presentation to a group of lawyers, I actually start off by saying, just take a moment and notice, if you can, that your brain is already in line to be looking for what's wrong with my presentation, right? So I'm going to advance a whole bunch of new ideas, and your brain is going to be scanning for what is the worst possible outcome if you thought this way, what is a logical inconsistency in what you're saying. If I take your premise to the nth ridiculous degree, does it stand up, right? That's how you attack any new piece of information. Again, this can be super useful when you are actually doing lawyer work, right? But when you're just trying to have a conversation with someone, especially a personal or a social conversation, unless the other person's a lawyer, that's not the orientation they're coming from. And frankly, even if they are a lawyer, it's not a orientation that makes a conversation kind of productive or pleasant, and it stymies communication, right? So often I say to people when I give this presentation, what would it be like if you stopped and tried to consciously think as I go through my presentation, what do I agree with here? What do I see here that might be useful, right? And we'll talk more about that in a minute when I talk about how you can counteract each of these ways of thinking. So overall, adversarial orientation is the way that lawyer brain is set up to immediately kind of critique or judge or analyze any kind of conversation that's coming at it, and to see the other person as a conversational adversary, right? That the orientation is like, one of us is going to win this, or you're going to say something that I'm going to figure out if it's worth agreeing with, as opposed to two people just trying to communicate with each other. Okay, so the third one is blame shifting or kind of defensiveness. So do you ever notice, for instance, that other lawyers seem defensive when you bring something up about their performance or behavior, right? And that can be in the office or at home. A lot of lawyers are married to other lawyers or date other lawyers or are related to other lawyers, right? It can be your family of origin. So fun fact, if you're a lawyer, you probably do this too. And it's so much easier to see in other people. When before I sort of came up with all of this coaching work, and before I learned the premise of the thought work, I used to think that my parents were super defensive. They're also lawyers. But I didn't think I was defensive at all, right? They were the problem. I was fine. As I started to do this work and become aware of my own thought processes and become more in tune with my physical reaction when people talk to me, I realized that I was super defensive also. And honestly, if you're a lawyer, you probably are too. But it's not because you're a bad person. It's not because you're essentially defensive, right? It's not about a character flaw. It comes from a really specific place, which is that law school teaches us to be terrified of being wrong, right? If you're wrong, it's malpractice, it's career suicide, it stands in for humiliation, right? If you think about the Socratic method, it starts super early. You go to law school, you're 1L year, all of a sudden you're being interrogated in front of 80 other people, and if you're wrong, you're humiliated, right? So we sort of grow up as lawyers being terrified of being wrong. And that spreads into the rest of our lives and makes us so afraid of failure and of blame for anything, right? And catastrophizing is part of why, because we always take things to the worst possible outcome. So it's not okay to make a small mistake or to be to blame for anything because it will mean something terrible, right? So like, it's not okay to have hurt your partner's feelings because it means they'll probably end up divorcing you because you're a terrible person. Like, that's what your brain is doing, right? It's not okay to have screwed up at work a little bit and quickly correct it, because if the partner finds out that you screwed up, then they won't trust you anymore and your career will be over, right? So what this means is that it's really hard for us to hear anyone object to our words or actions or ask us for something, or I find even just have other people describe us without feeling immediately on the defensive. Okay, the last form of lawyer brain I'm going to talk about is trouble spotting. So trouble spotting, just like in law school, is looking for what seems wrong, inconsistent, or out of place. And this can manifest as obsession over inconsequential details or small inconsistencies. So if you've ever been told that you're arguing like a lawyer in a conversation with a non-lawyer, this is usually the most obvious thing that you're doing out loud. A lot of the other lawyer brain aspects, you're sort of experiencing them internally, and they manifest in different ways, like catastrophizing can manifest as defensiveness. Trouble spotting you're usually doing proactively to the other person, right? So here's an example. When you're, the person you're dating says something and you instantly start scanning and you end up finding yourself saying things to them like, well, but that's not what you said last week. Last week you said you were out with your friend Fred and now you're saying Dave was there. Was Dave always there? Why didn't you tell me Dave was there, right? Or, well, now you're saying that you don't believe in this political principle, but 2 years ago when we talked about this, you said you did believe in this other thing that logically is related, so how can you be so inconsistent, right? It's like constantly scanning for anything that could be slightly inconsistent, or that could be a signal that something has been missed or hidden, right? It's sort of a form of suspicion almost. So this can be helpful at work for sure, right? If you're going to cross-examine a witness, you want to find inconsistencies. And yeah, at home, it might be helpful on rare occasions, like maybe, let's say, 1 out of 100 times you figure out actually that your spouse is cheating on you. But generally, that's not what's going on, right? Usually, you're just creating alienation and discord in the relationship. Because humans are not completely logical, and they're not completely consistent over time. And so when you treat somebody's previous words and actions as if they are, sort of stipulations or part of a contract or some kind of promise about future consistent beliefs and behavior, then you can get lost in this kind of trouble spotting and finding inconsistencies and bringing them up. And those have nothing to do with what the other person in the conversation is actually trying to communicate to you. Right? The other person in the conversation is just trying to tell you how they think about something or what they feel about something, right? And you're busy trying to sort of discredit that claim by pointing to times that they've been inconsistent about it, which does nothing, right? Doesn't make them feel that they're not entitled to what they were saying in the first place. And it just makes them feel like you don't care, right? Or you're being persnickety. And it keeps you from actually hearing them and maybe learning something. Okay, so those are the 4 forms of lawyer brain that are most problematic in personal relationships. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to manage lawyer brain and how to improve your relationships. So talk about it kind of generally, and then at the end I'm going to talk about each of the 4 ways I talked about and what you can do for each one. So awareness, acceptance, and actions. It's like AAA. First, awareness. So people always want to jump straight to changing their behavior, right? Just give us the tips and tricks. But you really can't skip over the part where you have to build and practice awareness. Because without this step, you don't actually understand how often you're responding from your lawyer brain and how to really get distance and be able to observe lawyer brain happening. So if you remember at the beginning, we talked about the thought work model and the idea that circumstances happen. You have a thought in reaction to the circumstance. That thought causes your feeling. So lawyer brain is happening in that thought space, right? What lawyer brain is a way of describing different patterns and types of thoughts that lawyers have in reaction to circumstances and that then create certain feelings, usually anxiety or anger or frustration. Those are usually the 3 that my lawyer clients present with the most. So in order to really start to be able to observe lawyer brain, you have to get that space between the thought and the feeling, and you have to watch it happen. And I want to be really clear, when you first start doing this work, you will absolutely not catch it before it happens. Right? You will feel a feeling, the stink bomb goes off, and then you will have to reverse engineer. You will have to go backwards. You'll have to ask yourself, wow, I'm really feeling anxious right now. What am I thinking? Right? What is the thought that I'm thinking? So the most important first step is simply practice noticing. Pay attention to yourself, to your thoughts, and your feelings. A really handy trick for when you're trying to learn to distinguish these things is that a feeling is just one word, and it's a sensation you can feel in your body. It's like anger, joy, sadness, fear, right? Those are feelings. And then there's sort of subtypes of all those feelings like nostalgia, wistfulness, right? Grief, joy, elation, love. Like there's different forms of them, but they're all one word, and they usually have a physical manifestation. If you find that when you ask yourself how you feel, what you say is a sentence, especially if it's a sentence that has to do with other people's behavior, that is not a feeling, that's a thought, right? So if you ask yourself, why am I angry? Well, I'm angry because I just feel like my partner should have come to this wedding that I asked them to come to with me and not gone to the sports game. That is not a feeling. That whole thing is a thought, right? Angry is the feeling, and you're angry because your thought is my partner should not have done this thing. They should have done what I wanted, right? So anytime you ask yourself how you feel and it's a long sentence, that's actually a thought. So again, awareness. Before you try to change anything, just try to notice and be more aware. Practice what I just said, distinguishing between your thoughts and your feelings. And here's the other thing to know. Even if this is all you do, it will help, right? Basically, this is meditation in a more analytical way, right? Actually, just practicing awareness of your thoughts and feelings helps you create a pause and less reactivity, right? Like, who knows exactly why that happens? The neuroscientists could explain it. You don't need to know for this. All you need to know is that just practicing awareness, even without anything else, will help you feel better. But it takes a while this way, and it's slow. And so there's 2 next pieces that you can do more proactively that will help you feel better sooner, which is my goal with coaching. The second one is acceptance. And everybody also wants to skip this one, right? Once you're aware of your lawyer brain, you have to practice accepting it. And that sounds counterintuitive because your goal is to change. But forcing change is like trying to white knuckle your way there. It's exhausting and it doesn't really work. So here is the solution, and if you take one thing away from this entire webinar, I want it to be this 8 words. Thoughts are not moral. They are just programs. Right? My clients often have so much judgment about themselves and their thoughts and their behavior, and as soon as they start to recognize lawyer brain, they start judging themselves for having lawyer brain, and then they start judging themselves for not being 100% different as soon as they learn the tools. Right? Judgment really drains your energy, and it makes you afraid to see clearly because you don't want to see the truth about yourself because you fear that you'll use it against yourself, right? So the reason that you don't want to see that you're defensive is because you know that you'll then think thoughts like, oh God, I'm always going to be this way. Nobody will be able to get close to me. No one will want to spend time with me. It's impossible to change it. And that those thoughts are going to make you feel sad or hopeless or anxious or depressed. Right? So you follow what I'm saying? You don't want to see yourself clearly because you are afraid that you'll use that clarity and that what you perceive against yourself, and it'll make you feel bad about yourself. The solution to all of this is to stop thinking that your thoughts mean anything about you as a person. Right, let me say that again. Your thoughts do not mean anything about you as a person. They are just programs. They are just sentences in your mind. They are like computer programs that somebody set 15 years ago and walked away from and never edited again. They have just been running on an unconscious loop in the back of your brain this whole time, but they do not mean anything about your essential personality, and they don't have any moral value, right? You can still have ethics and morals about your behavior, absolutely, and you can have a value about how you want to relate to your thoughts. Like I have a value of accepting my thoughts and of practicing becoming aware of them to get to know myself better. But I never judge myself for any thought that I have, right? If I judge myself, it is so much harder to change it. So acceptance means not just noticing it's happening, but really being okay with it, right? Noticing the thoughts you're having and really saying to yourself, okay, that's fine. Those thoughts are fine. I might decide I want to change them, but those thoughts are not bad. They don't mean anything is wrong with me. They don't mean anything bad about me. They have no moral value. Okay, so finally, once you have practiced acceptance and awareness, you can take action, right? And here I'm going to break down a couple of practices you can do for each of the, well, there are 4 things that I talked about. Apparently, I only put 3 on this slide. So I will talk about trouble spotting. I apologize that's not written down. So for catastrophizing, you want to ask yourself, what are you making the event mean, right? So when you have a small spat with your partner, or even a big one, and you're having a lot of feelings about it, ask yourself what the story you have about it is, right? What are the thoughts you're having about what this fight means? And then notice how those thoughts are making you feel, right? Ask yourself if there's any actual evidence that what you fear will happen, and look for evidence of the opposite. So to give you an example, I had a client, this is a work example, who was experiencing so much anxiety about her job because it was sort of very public in a certain way, and it was very detail-oriented, and so there were a lot of opportunities to make a mistake that everyone would know about if it happened. And her story was that this would be humiliating, and she would lose her job, and her career would be over, right? So that was catastrophizing. Her brain was telling her that if she made even a small mistake, she would basically lose her job, not be able to pay her mortgage, and her career would be over. Once I taught her how to notice that those thoughts were happening and see how they made her feel, right, totally anxious, and I asked her, is there any evidence that that's not what would happen? She very quickly was able to come up with the fact that there are several prominent members of her specialty who had made the kind of mistake she was afraid of, and everybody hadn't found out about it. It was public, and it was not that big a deal, right? They still had their jobs. They had actually done very well. They had gone on to even bigger and better positions afterwards. These mistakes had not derailed their career because in actual fact, what happened was that everyone thought, well, yeah, we do this hard, complicated thing, and sometimes people make mistakes, right? So that's what I mean by looking for evidence that a different outcome might be the case and seeing that there's not really evidence for what you fear happening. and noticing how each of those stories makes you feel. How does the catastrophe story make you feel? And then how does the opposite story make you feel, right? And that will help reinforce for your brain that your thoughts are what create your feelings. For adversarial orientation, although it is a cliche, take a breath before the conversation, right? Lawyers tend to respond immediately to stimuli because it's like we're all in college debate club. We think there's a timer running, right? Take a breath when something comes at you or before you're about to start a conversation. Just take a moment, get your brain into, okay, I'm going to try to practice awareness mode. And ask yourself what it would be like to experience the conversation if the premise you wanted to prove true was, I'm going to learn something from this interaction. Or this person has something new to tell me that I don't already know, right? What would it be like if you were looking for what's right and what makes sense and what's amazing about what you're about to hear, as opposed to what's wrong with it? For blame shifting and defensiveness, the first thing is to practice noticing the instinct to deflect or deny. It's very subtle, but for me, it manifests as a kind of a tightening in my body, like I kind of tense up. And I have this immediate desire to sort of like mentally hold up my hand, right? To quickly say, no, that's not true. And ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen if this was true, right? What if this was true? What if I didn't clean up the kitchen? What if I did miss something in the site checking? What's the worst thing that could happen? And you need to keep a check on yourself, right? Because your brain may want to catastrophize. So if you say to yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen because I missed this site check, and then your brain says you could get fired and not be able to pay your mortgage and live on the street, then you got to go through some thought work on that catastrophizing, right? Is that really true? Is everybody who's employed here never made a mistake before, right? Has anyone actually been fired for a site check mistake, right? You need to like engage with that story. Another thing that's really fun to do, lawyers hate this, is experiment with agreeing with what your partner says, like no matter what it is. Just whatever your spouse or your dating partner or your loved one says to you, just agree with it, right? Especially if it's about you and what you should have done differently. It is just a fascinating experiment in how hard that is for lawyers and why, and it will give you access to a lot of thoughts you have, right? And you will realize why you think it's so important to not accept blame or to not say you did anything wrong. Right, and you can notice all those fear of failure thoughts come up that law school really gives you. Another thing you can do, and this comes from the facilitation world, but it's actually a really interesting one, and that is saying and instead of but. So lawyers in particular who write a lot, this is a really interesting game to play. So like if you're emailing with a romantic partner, right? Usually lawyers who have done some self-awareness work and they want to try to validate other people's perspective, what I find is that they will write a phrase that says like, I hear what you're saying, or that's a good point. But then it's immediately followed with but, and then their opinion, and that's the correct way to do things or understand things, right? So switching from but to and really helps your brain see that both things have equivalent value. Right? Especially if you're having an interpersonal conflict with a romantic partner, your perspectives, one of them is not more right or objective than the other one, right? Holding on to the belief that one of them is more objectively right than the other one will only cause you suffering, right? Sometimes it'll cause you righteous indignation, sometimes anger or frustration, but in general, it's just going to cause you suffering. And the word but is a form of defensiveness that positions what you're about to say as being more true than the first thing. Right? Whereas if you say and, what you are signaling is that both these things can be true, right? Both your subjective interpretations of the interaction have equal validity. They are true to each of you in the same way, right? And that alone will take it to a place of we are having different experiences, but I want to hear about yours and I want to communicate about them rather than you've told me yours and I'm going to give lip service to validating it, but then I really want to reject it and convince you of mine. Right? And that will really change the tenor of your interactions. The last one is trouble spotting, which again, I'm sorry there's not a slide. For trouble spotting, a lot of the same advice applies, right? But one really useful thing to notice when you find yourself doing it, or if a partner kind of calls it out for you, right? Says like, well, why are you bringing up what I said 3 years ago? What does that have to do with anything, right? It's a good practice to stop and ask yourself, what does that have to do with anything, right? Why do I think this is important? Another good thing to ask yourself is, what is this person actually trying to communicate to me, right? As opposed to, how can I look for logical inconsistencies? How can I pick apart their argument? How can I invalidate it based on prior statements, like they're a hostile witness in a trial, right? Try to set all that aside and ask the affirmative question of yourself, what are they trying to tell me here, right? This person is taking the effort to communicate with me. They are trying to tell me something. What are they trying to convey to me? What is the essence of what they want me to know? And can I respond to that, right? Can I respond to the essence of what they're trying to tell me rather than fixating on the minor details, right? So if it's a political disagreement and you want to compare it to what they said 3 years ago, right? That's not the point. The point is, what are they trying to tell you right now about their values and what they hold dear as a person, right? What are they trying to show you about themselves? So that's trouble spotting. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for joining me.